Hello everyone, welcome back. In this lesson, I will be explaining how does function work in Python in general and then scope and lifetime of the variable. Here we can see how the function works in Python with the help of the flow diagram. In step 1, we create a function with a return statement. In step 2, we are calling the function with its name. And in step 3, the program control flow goes to the function and do some useful work. This return statement has an output. This output will be placed in place of the function called. The output of the return statement will be placed in front of the client variable. In step 5, the programmer may store the result in separate variable, means using any variable name. For example, here the result. This is how the function works in Python in general. Let us see the scope and lifetime of the variables. When we define a function with variables, then those variables scope is limited to that function. In Python, the scope of the variable is an area where a variable is declared. It is called the variable's local scope. We cannot access the local variable from outside of the function because the scope of the variable declared inside the function is local. Those variables are not visible from the outside of the function. Here the important thing to remember is the inner function does have access to the outer function's local scope. When we are executing a function, the life of the variables is up to running time. Once we return from the function, those variables get destroyed. So function does no need to remember the value of a variable from its previous call. If we look at the general diagram which describes the scope and lifetime of the variable, we are using local variable and global variable in this general program. And if we observe this general program carefully, local variable has been declared inside this function, any function, whereas the global variable is defined outside of this function. Local variable is inside the function and it is local to this function only, whereas global variable is defined outside this function and it can be accessed anywhere in the program. And after creating the function, we are using the print statement to call the global variable as well as the local variable. The important things to remember here is main program always search for the global variable and the global variable is global to the program flow. Local variable is for the local function only and the main program uses the global variable to perform a specified task. If we try to access the local variable in global scope, then we will get an error. Let us see practically how the scope and lifetime of the variables work in Python. In place of the global variable, we are using the name global underscore language, that is data science. And inside the function variable scope test, we are using one local variable with the name local underscore language, that is Python. And as per the definition, The inner function does have access to the outer function's local scope. Means inside this function we can access the global variable. So here the global variable is nothing but global underscore language. So we are using that global variable inside this function variable scope test in this print statement. And finally we are calling this function variable scope test. And outside of the function we are using the print statement with the global variable name. But at the same time outside of the function, if we try to call the local variable, then we will get an error. So already the spider IDLE is showing an error, undefined name local underscore language. This is because from the code analysis the interpreter already raising an error because this local underscore language is local to this function only. It is not a global variable. For the global variable we do not have any error message. Even we are using this even though we are using this global variable inside this function, because as per the definition the inner function does have access to the outer function's local scope. Therefore we can use this global variable inside the function. Let us run only up to this section, and here we can see there is no error. Let us try to execute this print statement and see what happens. So we got an error, name local underscore language is not defined. So this means we cannot access the local variable outside of the function. This is because this local variable is local to this function scope only. So that is the meaning of the scope of the variable. The scope of this local variable, that is local underscore language, is limited to this function area only. Where is the function area? This is the function area, means the function back, but not outside of this function. Whereas the scope of this global variable is global, means we can access this global variable anywhere in the program. The program may contain functions or nested functions, but we can use the global variable because the scope of this global variable is global. The scope of this local variable is local to this function only. So local variable has the scope limited to the function, whereas the global variable has the scope which is global to the main program, means for the entire program. Let us see how the local variable works in function. A local variable is a variable declared inside the function that is not accessible from outside of the function. The scope of the local variable is limited to that function only where it is declared. If we try to access the local variable from outside of the function, we will get an error called name error. So we are proving once again using two functions, function 1 and function 2. Inside the function 1, we are using the local variable, that is 786 with the value, and we are printing that value. And we are creating function 2 with the local variable which is declared inside the function 1. Look at here, inside the function 2 we are using the print statement and the local variable which is declared inside the function 1. Already the code analysis is showing an error. This local variable is local to this function 1 only, not we cannot access this local variable outside of this function, that is function 1. We can only access within this function, not outside of this function. Hence, if we try to use this local variable in function 2, we will get an error. Let us run this function and let us call this function. So we don't have any error. Let us try to run this function. the interpreter will run anyway, but when we try to call this function, we will get an error. So look at here, name local variable is not defined. Function will be evaluated. There is no error in evaluating the function because interpreter will look for the local variable globally or locally if it is available after evaluating the function. Once we call the function, the interpreter will search for the variable, local variable within this function as well as outside of the function. Since this local variable is present inside the function 1, so it becomes local to that function only. It is declared inside the function 1. And the interpreter at the same time searches for this local variable globally. And in this program section, there is no global variable with the name local underscore variable. Hence, interpreter will not able to identify this local variable and it will throw an error, name error. What I mean to say is, if we try to use this local variable outside of these functions like this with the values, for example 786, then you can see the error or errors have been gone immediately. This is because we are declaring this local variable inside this function 1 as well as we are declaring this variable, the name variable, outside of the function. Now this variable becomes the global variable and this variable becomes the local variable. So have you got? Let us remove this for the understanding purpose. Now you can see after removing this variable, immediately we got an error for the function 2 which uses the local variable declared inside the function 1. Thanks for watching this lesson. In the next lesson, we will see how to use the global variable in function.